Captain Jake Martinez stood on the bridge of the USS Defiance, watching the stars through the main screen when the communication alert sounded across the ship and his crew turned to look at him with worried faces as the transmission came through. On all frequencies at once, which was impossible according to human technology. But there it was happening right in front of their eyes, and Jake told his communications officer to put it on the main screen immediately. The image that appeared made everyone on the bridge step back in shock because it showed a massive reptilian creature with scales that seemed to shift colors in the light and eyes that burned like molten gold. And when it spoke, its voice echoed through the ship with a power that made the hull vibrate. And Jake knew immediately that humanity had just made contact with something far beyond their understanding. The creature identified itself as Ambassador Zethkar of the galactic hegemony, and explained that his people had been watching Earth for some time and had decided that humans were ready to join the galactic community, but only as servants to their betters, and the terms were simple and non-negotiable, and Jake felt his blood run cold as he listened to words that would change everything for his species. Earth had 30 standard days to surrender all military assets and accept vassal status under hegemony rule. And in return, humanity would receive protection and limited autonomy. But if they refused, the consequences would be swift and final, and complete annihilation would follow, and there would be no second chances or negotiations, and Jake realized he was witnessing the most important moment in human history. The transmission ended as suddenly as it began leaving the bridge in complete silence, and Jake looked around at his crew, seeing the same mix of fear and anger in their faces that he felt in his own heart, and he knew that this message was being received on every human ship and station and planet at the same moment. And soon the leaders of Earth would have to make an impossible choice. Back on Earth. President Claire Rodriguez was pulled from a budget meeting when her security chief burst into the room with news that would make her forget about every other problem humanity had ever faced, and within minutes she was in the Situation Room, surrounded by the most powerful people on the planet, all trying to understand what had just happened to their world, Admiral Ryan. Brooks spread out star charts and tactical reports while explaining that the hegemony appeared to control thousands of worlds across the galaxy and possessed technology that was centuries ahead of anything humans had developed, and their military strength was so overwhelming that resistance seemed impossible, but his voice carried a note of defiance that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. General Lisa Carter argued for immediate negotiations, saying that submission might not be so bad if it meant survival, and that humanity could work within the system to eventually gain more freedom. But Dr. Kevin Walsh, who had spent his life studying the possibilities of alien life, warned that accepting servitude could mean the end of human culture and independence forever. The debates raged for days as world leaders struggled with the most difficult decision in human history, and some nations wanted to surrender immediately, while others demanded that Earth fight regardless of. The odds and the clock kept ticking toward the deadline, while strange energy signatures began appearing throughout human space as hegemony scout ships took positions around key systems. Rodriguez found herself unable to sleep as she walked the halls of the White House, thinking about the billions of people who would live or die based on her decision, and she thought about all the humans who had fought and died for freedom throughout history, and wondered if their sacrifices would mean nothing if she chose to kneel before these alien masters. On the 28th day, riots broke out in major cities around the world as people demanded action one way or another, and some begged their leaders to accept the hegemony terms, while others marched in the streets carrying signs that read, "Better to die free than live as slaves." And Rodriguez knew that humanity was tearing itself apart while the deadline approached. The night before the final day, Rodriguez stood alone in the Oval Office, looking up at the stars and thinking about what it meant to be human. And she realized that throughout their history, humans had always chosen the hard path when it mattered most, and had never accepted defeat when their core values were threatened. And freedom was the most basic human value of all. On the 29th day, Rodriguez walked into the United Nations Assembly Hall, where representatives from every nation on Earth waited to hear humanity's answer, and the room fell silent as she approached the podium, knowing that her next words would echo through history and determine whether humans would remain free or spend eternity as servants to alien masters. She looked out at the faces before her and thought about every human who had ever lived and died for the right to choose their own destiny, and she thought about the children who deserved to grow up free, and she thought about what her ancestors would say if they could see this moment. And then she spoke the words that would change everything. We choose to stand as free beings, whatever the cost, and if the galaxy demands we kneel, then the galaxy will learn what happens when humanity says no. The hegemony response came exactly 12 hours after Rodriguez finished speaking, and Admiral Corfith, commanding the Third Hegemony Fleet, launched simultaneous attacks against 3 human frontier colonies, expecting to crush human resistance in a matter of hours and show the galaxy what happened to species that dared refuse the great empire. But what he found waiting for him was something no hegemony commander had ever encountered before. On the mining world of New Texas, Colonel Amy Turner heard the attack sirens and immediately began organizing the colonial militia into fighting units, using the mining tunnels and industrial complexes as cover, while hegemony ground forces landed expecting to face terrified civilians, but instead found themselves fighting trained soldiers who knew every inch of their territory and refused to give ground. The hegemony troops had advanced weapons and armor that should have made them invincible against primitive human equipment. But Turner had spent months preparing for this moment, and her people turned the mining equipment into weapons and used the underground tunnels to appear behind enemy lines and strike at vulnerable points before disappearing again into the darkness. Every corridor became a battlefield, and every room became a trap, as human defenders used their knowledge of the facility to turn the hegemony advantages against them, and the alien soldiers found themselves lost in a maze of industrial machinery while human fighters picked them off one by one using tactics that seemed impossible to predict or counter in space above New Texas. Commander Steve Parker led a desperate defense of Kepler Station using 6 outdated human frigates against 12 sleek hegemony cruisers, and everyone knew his small fleet should be destroyed in minutes. But Parker had studied every battle in human history and decided that if he was going to die, he would make it cost the enemy everything. Parker ordered his ships to charge straight at the hegemony formation, ignoring their superior weapons, and using ramming attacks that caught the aliens completely off guard, because no civilized species had used such primitive tactics in thousands of years, and the sight of human ships deliberately crashing into hegemony vessels sent shockwaves through the enemy fleet. The most shocking victory came at the Battle of Titan's Gate, where Captain Nicole Green commanded the newest human dreadnought UES Retribution against a full hegemony battle group and used experimental antimatter torpedoes that the aliens considered crude and primitive, but which proved devastatingly effective when used in ways no one had ever attempted before. Green waited until the hegemony ships moved into close formation before launching her entire torpedo spread at once, creating a chain reaction that destroyed the enemy flagship and severely damaged 2 other vessels, and the explosion lit up space for hundreds of kilometers while Green broadcast a message to every ship in the system that humanity would never surrender. News of these impossible human victories spread throughout hegemony space faster than official reports could be filed, and species that had served the Empire for centuries began whispering among themselves about how these primitive humans with their crude weapons had managed to hurt the seemingly invincible masters who ruled the galaxy. The Battle of New Texas lasted 3 days, and when it ended, Colonel Turner stood in the ruins of the main mining complex, surrounded by the bodies of hegemony soldiers who had died trying to capture a facility that should have fallen in hours, and her people had held their ground against impossible odds using nothing but determination and superior knowledge of their own territory. Commander Parker died when his flagship exploded after ramming a hegemony cruiser. But his sacrifice inspired his remaining crews to fight even harder, and by the end of the battle, 2 hegemony ships had been destroyed, and 3 others were badly damaged, while the human defenders had proven that advanced technology meant nothing against pure human stubborn courage. Captain Green became an instant hero throughout human space. When footage of her victory reached Earth and President Rodriguez used the battle as proof that humanity could fight back against the hegemony and win. But she also knew that these early victories were just the beginning of what would be a long and bloody war. Admiral Korth found himself in the impossible position of having to explain to his superiors how human resistance had proven so much fiercer than anticipated, and he requested immediate reinforcements while privately wondering if the hegemony had finally encountered a species that simply could not be conquered through normal means. The Hegemony High Council received Korth's reports with growing concern because no species had ever inflicted such casualties on their forces. During initial contact, and the idea that primitive humans could challenge their authority seemed impossible, but the evidence was undeniable, and suddenly the 30-day ultimatum seemed like it had been a terrible mistake. Back on Earth, the news of these victories created a wave of celebration that swept across the planet as people realized that their leaders had made the right choice and that humanity could actually stand against the galactic empire. But those who understood military strategy knew that the real war was just beginning. Dr. Kevin Walsh analyzed captured hegemony technology and realized that their enemies relied heavily on overwhelming technological superiority and had never developed the kind of tactical flexibility that came from constant warfare, and he began to understand that humanity possessed advantages that had nothing to do with weapons or ships. General Lisa Carter studied the battle reports and saw patterns that gave her hope because the hegemony forces had responded predictably to human attacks and seemed unable to adapt quickly to new tactics, and she realized that human unpredictability might be their greatest weapon in the coming war. President Rodriguez addressed the world again after the frontier victories and told humanity that they had proven they could fight, but that the real test was yet to come, because the hegemony would not make the same mistakes twice, and the next attacks would be larger and more determined than anything they had faced so far. The galaxy watched in amazement as news of human resistance spread to every corner of known space, and for the first time in thousands of years, species that had accepted hegemony rule began to wonder if rebellion was possible, and if these strange humans from a backwater world might actually be able to challenge the established order. Admiral Korth prepared his fleet for the next phase of operations, knowing that he had underestimated human capabilities and that the easy victory he had expected was now impossible. But he still believed that superior numbers and technology would eventually overwhelm human resistance and restore hegemony authority over this troublesome species that refused to accept their proper place in the galactic order. Dr. Elena Foster worked day and night in the secret research facility beneath Geneva, studying every piece of hegemony technology that human forces had captured during the frontier battles, and what she discovered changed everything humanity thought. They knew about their enemies and gave them the first real hope that victory might actually be possible against impossible odds. The advanced alien technology was impressive, but Foster noticed something that the hegemony themselves seemed unaware of, which was that their weapons and tactics had remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years, and their superiority had made them lazy and predictable in ways that could be exploited by an enemy willing to think outside conventional military. Dr. Foster realized that the hegemony had conquered the galaxy through overwhelming technological advantage and had never needed to develop the kind of tactical innovation that came from fighting desperate battles against equal opponents. And this meant they had no experience dealing with enemies who refused to follow established patterns of warfare. Her breakthrough came when she analyzed battle recordings and saw how hegemony commanders reacted with confusion when human forces employed suicide attacks and ramming maneuvers because such tactics were considered primitive and barbaric by galactic standards, but were devastatingly effective when used by people with nothing left to lose. The research led to the formation of The Terran Resistance Corps under General Pete Morrison, who understood that humanity's survival depended on embracing their reputation as unpredictable barbarians and using unconventional warfare tactics that would keep the enemy constantly off balance and unable to develop effective counter-strategies. Morrison began converting civilian vessels into weapons of war using techniques that no military academy would ever teach because they violated every principle of civilized combat, but which worked perfectly against enemies who expected their opponents to follow logical tactical doctrines and fight fair battles using approved methods. The first major test of these new tactics came when Ambassador Helen Wright made secret contact with the Nithran Consortium, which was a group of insectoid species that had served the hegemony for centuries, but had grown tired of being treated as second-class citizens, despite their superior engineering skills and mechanical knowledge. Wright proposed something that had never been attempted in galactic history, which was a joint military operation between humans and aliens against their common hegemony oppressors, and the Nithrans were intrigued by human boldness and agreed to participate in a small-scale mission to test whether cooperation was possible. Captain Danny Bell commanded a modified cargo hauler called Spirit of Earth that had been converted into a stealth vessel using Nithran technology combined with human ingenuity, and his mission was to work with Nithran engineer Clix TH to destroy a major hegemony supply depot in the Proxima sector without being detected. The operation required Bell to trust alien technology he did not understand, while Clix TH had to rely on human tactical thinking that seemed chaotic and random, but somehow produced results that careful planning could never achieve, and together they created a new form of warfare that neither species could have developed alone. They approached the supply depot using a flight path that made no tactical sense according to galactic military doctrine, but which allowed them to avoid hegemony patrol routes and sensor grids because Bell had studied the psychology of their enemies and understood that they would never expect an attack from such an illogical direction. The destruction of the depot sent shockwaves through hegemony command because the facility had been considered impregnable, and the method of attack was so unprecedented that their analysts could not determine how it had been accomplished or whether similar strikes might be planned against other installations. News of the successful human-alien cooperation spread quickly through underground networks, and other species began making secret contact with human representatives to discuss the possibility of rebellion against hegemony rule. And for the first time in galactic history, a multi-species resistance movement began to form. The Kaleth Republic, which consisted of energy-based beings that had been forced to serve as hegemony communications operators, sent encrypted messages offering to disrupt enemy command networks, while the Vorthak mining guilds secretly began stockpiling weapons and equipment for possible future use against their masters. General Morrison realized that humanity had accidentally discovered something more powerful than any weapon, which was the ability to inspire other species to fight for their freedom. And he began developing plans for coordinated resistance operations that would stretch hegemony forces across multiple star systems simultaneously. Dr. Foster continued analyzing alien technology and made another crucial discovery, which was that hegemony computer systems were designed to predict and counter logical tactical decisions, but became unreliable when faced with truly random or irrational choices, and this gave human forces a significant advantage in electronic warfare. The Hegemony High Council began receiving reports of unrest throughout their empire as species that had been loyal for millennia started questioning the established order and demanding greater autonomy, and some regions experienced their first rebellions in centuries, while hegemony forces struggled to maintain control. President Rodriguez announced the formation of the Galactic Liberation Alliance, which was a formal organization dedicated to freeing all sentient species from hegemony oppression, and she invited any civilization that desired freedom to join the fight against tyranny, regardless of their previous relationship with Earth. The response was overwhelming as representatives from dozens of species made secret contact with human agents and began coordinating resistance activities in their home systems while sharing intelligence about hegemony, weaknesses, and tactical vulnerabilities that could be exploited by Allied forces. Admiral Ryan Brooks developed new fleet tactics that combined human unpredictability with alien technological advantages and created mixed species crews that could operate equipment from multiple civilizations while maintaining the chaotic fighting style that had proven so effective against hegemony forces. The war began to change from a simple conflict between humans and the hegemony into a galaxy-wide struggle between freedom and oppression as more species joined the rebellion and hegemony forces found themselves fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who shared intelligence and coordinated their attacks. Captain Bell and Engineer Clix Tha became symbols of interspecies cooperation as they led increasingly daring raids against hegemony installations and proved that former enemies could work together effectively when they shared common goals and were willing to trust each other despite their different backgrounds and cultures. The hegemony realized too late that their decision to crush human resistance had triggered something far more dangerous than a simple military rebellion, because humanity had shown the galaxy that the great empire could be challenged and defeated by species willing to fight for their freedom regardless of the odds against them. High Commander Vexstar of the hegemony received emergency authorization to deploy the 5th and 7th Fleets in a massive operation designed to crush human resistance once and for all, because the rebellion had spread beyond acceptable limits and threatened the stability of the entire galactic order that had maintained peace for 10,000 years. The combined fleet represented the largest military force ever assembled by the hegemony, with over 300 capital ships and enough firepower to sterilize entire star systems, but Vexstar had studied the human tactical reports and knew that this would not be a conventional campaign against a civilized enemy. Admiral Catherine Hill commanded the human defense fleet in what everyone knew would be a fighting retreat through the Perseus Arm, because her ships were outnumbered 10-1 and outgunned by weapons that could destroy planets. But she had learned from the frontier battles that superior firepower meant nothing against enemies who refused to fight. Fairhill divided her fleet into small, fast-moving units that could strike at enemy supply lines and communication networks before disappearing into asteroid fields and nebulae where hegemony sensors could not track them effectively, and each human ship became an independent predator hunting for targets of opportunity. The Battle of Wolf's Bane became the perfect example of human tactical thinking when Commander Alex Johnson led the frigate Defiant Spirit on what appeared to be a suicide run through the center of a hegemony formation, while hidden human ships waited in ambush positions throughout the surrounding space. Johnson broadcast false surrender signals that caused the hegemony ships to move into capture formation, which exposed their vulnerable sensor arrays and engine sections to devastating attacks from the concealed human vessels that emerged from hiding at the exact moment when enemy defenses were weakest. The destruction of 6 hegemony cruisers in less than 10 minutes sent shockwaves through Vexstar's command structure, because the attack had violated every principle of civilized warfare and demonstrated that humans would use any tactic, no matter how dishonorable, to achieve victory against superior forces on the ground. Major Beth Clark organized civilian populations on occupied worlds into effective fighting forces, using techniques that transformed ordinary people into guerrilla fighters capable of using captured hegemony equipment against its creators, and her training manual became the foundation for resistance movements throughout the galaxy. Clark's methods were brutally simple and effective because she taught people to use their knowledge of local terrain and infrastructure to create killing zones where advanced alien technology became useless, and superior numbers meant nothing against defenders who knew every hiding place and escape route. The hegemony response grew increasingly desperate as their casualties mounted, and they began employing orbital bombardment against civilian targets, believing that terror tactics would break human morale and force the rebels to surrender. But the strategy backfired completely when it turned neutral. Species against the Empire. News of hegemony atrocities spread through underground networks, and species that had remained loyal for centuries began questioning whether their masters were the civilized beings they claimed to be, and rebellions broke out in star systems that had been peaceful for millennia. Dr. Nathan Cross revealed the secret weapon that humanity had been developing since the war began, which was the Prometheus project that used human unpredictability as the basis for technology that literally could not be anticipated by enemy computers or tactical analysis systems. The project created weapons that evolved in real time using random number generators based on human brain patterns, and these systems changed their behavior, constantly making it impossible for hegemony computers to calculate effective countermeasures or defensive strategies. Commander Johnson tested the first Prometheus weapon during the Battle of Centauri Station when his ship used adaptive missiles that altered their attack patterns every few seconds, and the hegemony point defense systems could not track projectiles that changed course and speed according to no logical pattern. The psychological impact on hegemony forces was devastating because their entire military doctrine was based on technological superiority and predictable tactical responses, but the Prometheus weapons made their advantages meaningless and forced them to fight on terms they could not understand or control. Admiral Hill used the new technology to launch Operation Wildfire, which was a coordinated series of attacks against hegemony installations throughout human space, using tactics that seemed completely random, but which were actually carefully planned to create maximum confusion and terror among enemy forces. The operation succeeded beyond all expectations as hegemony commanders found themselves unable to predict where the next attack would come from or what form it would take, and their response became increasingly panicked as they realized that traditional military thinking was useless against human tactical innovation. High Commander Vexstar requested additional reinforcements and authorization to use planet-killing weapons against human worlds, but the Hegemony High Council refused because such extreme measures would turn the entire galaxy against them and prove that they were no better than the barbarians they claimed to fight. The war reached a turning point when the Hegemony deployed their ultimate weapon, which was a massive space station called the World Killer that could destroy entire planets and was intended to end human resistance through a demonstration of overwhelming power that would terrify all species into submission. Commander Tony Garcia volunteered to lead a suicide mission against the superweapon using a ship loaded with antimatter charges that would detonate inside the station's core, and Garcia knew that his death would save billions of lives and prove that human courage could overcome any technological advantage. The destruction of the World Killer created an explosion visible from 17 star systems and became a symbol of hope for every oppressed species in the galaxy, while proving that the hegemony was not invincible and could be defeated by people willing to sacrifice everything for freedom. The explosion marked the beginning of the end for hegemony authority, as rebellions erupted throughout their empire, and species that had served as loyal subjects for thousands of years rose up against their masters, inspired by the example of human courage and determination. Admiral Hill received reports that Nithran Engineering Corps had captured 3 major shipyards, while Vorthak mining guilds had seized control of mineral extraction facilities that supplied raw materials for hegemony military production, and the rebellion was becoming a coordinated galaxy-wide revolution. The Caliph Republic used their control of communications networks to broadcast human resistance propaganda to every corner of known space, and the message was simple but powerful, which was that freedom was possible, and that no species had to accept oppression from beings who claimed superiority through force alone. High Commander Vexstar found himself fighting a war on dozens of fronts against enemies who shared intelligence and coordinated their attacks while using tactics that made no sense according to established military doctrine, but which proved devastatingly effective against traditional hegemony responses. The hegemony made their greatest mistake when they captured Admiral Ryan Brooks during a reconnaissance mission and decided to execute him in a public broadcast that was transmitted throughout human space as a demonstration of what happened to those who oppose the galactic order. But they completely misunderstood human psychology and the power of martyrdom. Brooks stood before the execution chamber with his hands bound and his uniform torn, but his back straight and his voice steady as he spoke his final words, which were heard by every human in the galaxy and many alien species who had secretly tuned in to witness this moment of hegemony. Justice. Earth stands free, whatever the cost, he said, and those 6 words became a rallying cry that spread through human space faster than any military communication and transformed Brooks from a captured officer into a symbol of everything humanity was fighting for and the price they were willing to pay. The execution video was meant to demoralize human resistance, but instead it had the opposite effect, as recruitment for the Terran Resistance Corps increased dramatically, and previously neutral human colonies declared their intention to fight regardless of the consequences. Because Brooks' death had shown them what true courage looked like, Captain Monica Hayes received authorization for the most daring rescue mission in human history when intelligence reports revealed that hundreds of human prisoners were being held on the hegemony prison world of Tartarus Prime, which was considered escape-proof and was used to break the spirits of captured rebels. Hayes assembled a team of volunteers from multiple species, including Nithran, stealth specialists, and Vorthak, demolition experts who were willing to risk everything to free the prisoners and strike a blow against hegemony authority that would demonstrate the power of interspecies cooperation. The mission required Hayes to navigate through 3 layers of hegemony defenses using captured enemy vessels and forged identification codes, while her team prepared to infiltrate the most secure facility in the galaxy using nothing but courage and improvised equipment. The breakthrough came when Nithran, engineer Zilth, managed to hack into the prison computer system using human chaos theory algorithms that confused the security programs long enough for the rescue team to reach the detention levels where they found conditions that shocked even hardened soldiers. The prisoners had been subjected to torture and psychological conditioning designed to break their will to resist. But when they saw Hayes and her mixed species team, they realized that the rebellion was stronger than ever, that their sacrifices had not been in vain. Hayes broadcast footage of the prison conditions throughout the galaxy using Kaleth communication networks, and the images of hegemony brutality turned public opinion against the Empire as species that had believed propaganda about civilized rule, realized the truth about their masters. The rescue mission freed over 400 prisoners, including key resistance leaders who had been captured during earlier battles and their return to active duty, provided a massive boost to rebel morale while proving that no hegemony facility was truly secure against determined attackers. The Great Rebellion began in earnest when 17 species simultaneously declared independence from hegemony rule, in a coordinated uprising that had been planned through secret communications networks established by human intelligence operatives working with alien resistance groups. The Vorthak Consortium announced their withdrawal from all mining agreements with the hegemony and began using their industrial facilities to produce weapons for rebel forces, while Nithran engineers shared advanced technology with human scientists to create new defensive systems. The crystalline Etherians, who had been silent for centuries, suddenly began broadcasting poetry and music throughout their space as they rediscovered concepts of beauty and freedom that had been suppressed under hegemony cultural policies, and their artistic renaissance inspired similar movements on other worlds. General Lisa Carter commanded the liberation of New Geneva, which became the first major human colony to be completely freed from hegemony control, and her forces employed new tactics that combined human creativity with alien technology to achieve what military experts had considered impossible. The battle for New Geneva lasted 6 days and demonstrated the effectiveness of multi-species cooperation as human soldiers fought alongside Nithran technicians and Vorthak heavy weapons specialists, while Calith operators coordinated communications and intelligence gathering. Carter used psychological warfare techniques that terrified hegemony defenders because human tactics seemed to violate the basic laws of military logic, and enemy commanders found themselves unable to predict or counter moves that appeared to be based on pure random chance. The victory at New Geneva proved that the hegemony could be beaten on their own terms using conventional military objectives. But the cost was enormous, as Carter lost nearly half her forces in the fighting and realized that liberation would require sacrifices that tested the limits of human endurance. The conflict reached its climax when intelligence reports revealed that the hegemony was preparing to deploy their most powerful weapon, which was a fleet of planet-killer ships that would systematically destroy every world that had joined the rebellion and end the uprising through genocidal terror. President Rodriguez made the decision that would define her legacy when she authorized Operation Phoenix, which was a preemptive strike against the hegemony staging area, using every available human ship in a desperate attempt to prevent the massacre of billions of innocent beings. Admiral Catherine Hill received command of the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled, including ships from rebel species that had committed their military forces to the joint operation, and she knew that failure would mean the end of everything they had fought for. The fleet included experimental vessels using Prometheus technology that could adapt their weapons and defenses in real time, while human crews worked alongside alien specialists who brought their own tactical knowledge and advanced equipment to the combined force. Hill developed a battle plan that used human unpredictability as its core element, with each ship commander authorized to make independent tactical decisions based on their assessment of local conditions rather than following rigid orders from central command. The approach violated every principle of coordinated fleet operations, but Hill understood that rigid planning would be useless against an enemy that possessed superior firepower, and that victory would depend on chaos and improvisation rather than careful strategy. Commander Garcia led the advance force in a modified destroyer that had been equipped with Nithran stealth systems and human weapons designed to punch through hegemony shields using concentrated antimatter bursts that could cripple capital ships with single hits. The battle began when Garcia transmitted Brooks' final words across all frequencies as his ship charged directly into the center of the hegemony. Formation and his sacrifice opened a gap in enemy defenses that allowed the main human fleet to penetrate their battle line. The explosion of Garcia's ship created a chain reaction that destroyed 3 hegemony cruisers and damaged the flagship, while proving once again that human courage could overcome any technological advantage when backed by absolute determination to protect freedom. The final confrontation began when President Claire Rodriguez led a coalition fleet of free species to the hegemony capital world of Zerion Prime, where High Counselor Mortax had ruled the galaxy for over 2,000 years from his crystalline throne room that overlooked the ancient city where countless civilizations had come to bow before their conquerors. Rodriguez transmitted one final offer of peaceful surrender to the hegemony leadership, explaining that the old order was finished, and that species throughout the galaxy had chosen freedom over servitude. But Mortax responded with rage and disbelief that primitive organics could challenge his perfect eternal empire. The Battle of Zerion became the largest space engagement in galactic history as ships from dozens of species converged on the capital system in a final assault that would determine whether the galaxy would remain under hegemony rule or enter a new age of freedom and cooperation. Fleet Admiral Patricia Scott commanded the combined liberation forces using tactics that blended human unpredictability with the best military knowledge from every rebel species, and her fleet included vessels that represented the hopes and dreams of billions of beings who had never known true independence. The fighting spread across 3 solar systems as hegemony loyalist forces made their last stand defending the world that had been the center of galactic power for 10 millennia. But they found themselves facing enemies who fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. Human ships upgraded with Nithran technology and Vorthak weapons systems led the assault, while Kaleth operators coordinated communications between forces that spoke hundreds of different languages, but shared the common goal of ending tyranny forever. The breakthrough came when Colonel Sam Miller led a ground assault on the Hegemony Command Center, using a mixed force of humans and aliens who had learned to fight together as brothers in arms, despite their different species and cultures and backgrounds. Miller's army included Nithran engineers who could bypass hegemony security systems and Vorthak warriors whose natural strength made them perfect for close-quarters combat, while human soldiers provided the tactical innovation that had proven so effective throughout the war. The march on the capital became a symbol of everything the rebellion represented as beings from across the galaxy walked together toward the heart of hegemony, power-carrying weapons taken from their former oppressors, and flags representing worlds that had chosen freedom over safety. The sight of this diverse army advancing through the ancient streets broke the morale of hegemony defenders who had been taught that their empire was eternal and that rebellion was impossible, but now faced proof that their supposedly perfect order could be challenged and destroyed. Rodriguez entered the throne room where Mortax waited, surrounded by the artifacts of 10,000 years of conquest, and the ancient being could not comprehend how his magnificent empire had crumbled before the assault of species he considered barely civilized barbarians. The confrontation between them represented more than just a political discussion, because it was a clash between 2 completely different philosophies of governance, with Mortax defending hierarchy and order, while Rodriguez spoke for equality and the right of all beings to determine their own destiny. Mortax demanded to know how primitive humans had managed to inspire such widespread rebellion, and Rodriguez explained simply that freedom was not a gift to be granted by rulers, but a natural right that belonged to every sentient being, regardless of their technology or military power. "You demanded we kneel," Rodriguez said, "but we chose to stand, and that choice made all the difference because it showed the galaxy that submission was not inevitable, and that even the greatest empire could fall when enough people decided they would rather die free than live as slaves." The surrender ceremony took place in the same chamber where countless species had been forced to accept hegemony rule. But now, Mortax signed documents that dissolved his empire and established the Galactic Federation as a voluntary alliance of free worlds governed by principles of mutual respect and cooperation. The transition was not easy because 10,000 years of imperial rule had created systems and attitudes that could not be changed overnight, but the example of human determination and interspecies cooperation provided a foundation for building something better than what had come before. Admiral Scott oversaw the peaceful transition of power as hegemony military forces were disbanded and their weapons turned over to the new Federation fleet, while former imperial worlds were given the choice of joining the alliance or remaining independent as long as they respected the rights of others. The memorial to the human resistance was built on New Geneva, with the names of all who had died for freedom carved into walls of stone that would stand for millennia, and at its base, the inscription read that when tyranny demanded submission, humanity taught the galaxy to stand. 50 years later, Ambassador Helen Wright addressed the Federation Council on the anniversary of humanity's first refusal to kneel and spoke about how the galaxy had changed from a place of oppression and fear into a community where trade and culture flourished. Between free peoples, children of dozens of species learned about the Great Rebellion in schools throughout Federation space, and they studied how a small, stubborn species from a backwater world had inspired the galaxy to reject thousands of years of tyranny through their simple refusal to accept defeat. The lesson was always the same, which was that freedom belonged to everyone, and that no being had the right to rule over others through force alone, and that when good people stood together, they could overcome any oppression, no matter how powerful or ancient it seemed. Captain Jake Martinez now commanded the exploration vessel New Horizon as it charted territories beyond the galactic rim, searching for new worlds and new civilizations that might benefit from contact with the Federation and the principles of freedom that humanity had helped establish. Somewhere among the distant stars, other species might face their own moments of choice between submission and resistance, and if they chose to fight, they would not face that struggle alone, because the galaxy had learned what happened when free beings refused to kneel. The stars themselves seemed brighter now, lit by the fire of freedom that humanity had helped kindle, and that would burn for generations to come as a beacon of hope for any who found themselves oppressed and wondered whether rebellion was possible against impossible odds.